The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet. "Holmes," said I, as I stood one morning in our bow window looking down the street. "Look at that man. He's clearly gone mad. It's a shame his family lets him wander around alone like that." My friend Sherlock Holmes, still half asleep in his armchair, slowly got up and looked over my shoulder, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dressing gown. It was a bright, crisp February morning, and the snow from the day before lay thick on the ground, sparkling in the winter sun. The traffic in the middle of Baker Street had churned the snow into a brown, crumbly path. But on either side, and along the edges of the sidewalks, it was as pristine as when it fell. The pavements had been cleaned and scraped, but they were still dangerously slippery, so there were fewer people out than usual. In fact, the only person coming from the direction of the Metropolitan Station was this single gentleman whose strange behavior had caught my eye. He was a man of about 50, tall and rather stout, with a strong, striking face and a commanding presence. He was dressed in a somber but expensive style, a black frock coat, a shiny top hat, neat brown gaiters, and well-cut pearl-gray trousers. Yet, his actions were a comical contrast to his dignified appearance, for he was running at a good pace, with occasional little hops, like a weary man not used to putting much strain on his legs. As he ran, he jerked his hands up and down, wagged his head, and contorted his face into the most unusual expressions. "What on earth is wrong with him?" I asked. "He's looking at the numbers on the houses." "I believe he's coming here," said Holmes, rubbing his hands together. "Here?" "Yes, I think he's coming to see me for a consultation. I think I recognize the signs. Ha! Didn't I tell you?" As he spoke, the man, puffing and blowing, rushed towards our door and pulled at our doorbell, making the whole house echo with its clang. A few moments later, he was in our room, still puffing, still making gestures, but with a look of such profound grief and despair in his eyes that our smiles instantly vanished, replaced by pity and horror. For a moment, he couldn't speak, but swayed back and forth, tugging at his hair like someone driven to the very edge of reason. Then, suddenly springing to his feet, he slammed his head against the wall with such force that we both rushed forward and pulled him back to the center of the room. Sherlock Holmes gently pushed him into the armchair and, sitting beside him, patted his hand and spoke to him in the soothing, reassuring tones he was so good at employing. "You've come to tell me your story, haven't you?" said Holmes. "You're tired from hurrying here. Why don't you wait until you've caught your breath, and then I'll be happy to look into any little problem you might want to share." The man sat for a moment, his chest heaving, struggling to control his emotions. Then he wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, pursed his lips, and turned to face us. "You probably think I'm mad, don't you?" he said. "I can see you've been through something difficult," responded Holmes. "God knows I have. A terrible trouble, so sudden and so awful, it's enough to drive me mad. Public disgrace I could have faced, even though I am a man whose character has never been tarnished. Personal troubles are a part of every man's life, but when they come together in such a horrifying way, they shake my very soul. Besides, it's not just me. The very noblest people in the land could suffer unless some way is found out of this terrible mess." "Please calm down, sir," said Holmes, "and tell me clearly who you are and what has happened to you." "My name," answered our visitor, "is probably familiar to you. I am Alexander Holder, of the banking firm of Holder and Stevenson, of Threadneedle Street." The name was indeed well known to us as belonging to the senior partner in the second-largest private banking concern in the City of London. What could have happened, then, to bring one of the foremost citizens of London to this most pitiable pass? We waited, full of curiosity, until, with another effort, he braced himself to tell his story. "I feel that time is of value," he said. "That is why I hastened here when the police inspector suggested that I should secure your cooperation. I came to Baker Street by the Underground and hurried from there on foot, because the cabs move slowly through this snow. That is why I was so out of breath, for I am a man who takes very little exercise. I feel better now, and I will tell you the facts as briefly and clearly as I can. It is, of course, well known to you that in a successful banking business, it's as important to find profitable investments for our funds as it is to attract new customers and depositors. One of our most lucrative ways of investing money is by providing loans, where the security is very reliable. We've done a lot of this in recent years, and there are many noble families to whom we've loaned large sums of money using their pictures, libraries, or silverware as collateral. Yesterday morning, I was sitting in my office at the bank when one of the clerks brought me a card. I jumped when I saw the name, for it was none other than, well, perhaps I shouldn't even mention it to you, but it was a name that's known all over the world, one of the most prestigious, noble, and exalted names in England. I was overwhelmed by the honor and attempted to say so when he entered, but he plunged right into business like a man who wants to get a disagreeable task over with quickly. "Mr. Holder," he said, "I've been told you're in the habit of lending money." "The firm does so when the security is good," I answered. "It's absolutely essential that I have £50,000 right away," he said. "I could, of course, borrow such a small sum 10 times over from my friends, but I prefer to make it a matter of business and handle it myself. In my position, you'll understand that it's unwise to put yourself under obligations." "How long would you need the money for, may I ask?" I asked. "Next Monday, I have a large sum due to me, and I'll certainly repay what you advance, with whatever interest you think is fair. But I really need the money immediately." "I would be happy to lend you the money without any further discussion from my own personal funds," I said. "But it would put a bit of a strain on my own finances. On the other hand, if I'm to do this on behalf of the firm, then, in fairness to my partner, I must insist that, even in your case, we follow all the usual procedures." "I'd much prefer it that way," he said, picking up a square, black Morocco case that he had placed beside his chair. "You've undoubtedly heard of the Beryl Coronet?" "One of the most precious public possessions in the empire," I said. "Precisely." He opened the case, and there, nestled in soft, flesh-colored velvet, lay the magnificent piece of jewelry he had mentioned. "There are 39 enormous beryls," he said, "and the gold work is priceless. The lowest estimate would put the coronet's value at twice the amount I've asked for. I'm prepared to leave it with you as my security." I took the precious case in my hands and looked from it to my illustrious client, rather unsure what to say. "You doubt its value?" he asked. "Not at all. I only doubt the propriety of my leaving it. You can rest assured about that. I wouldn't dream of doing so unless I was absolutely certain I'd be able to reclaim it in 4 days. It's a mere formality. Is the security sufficient?" "Ample." "You understand, Mr. Holder, that I'm giving you a strong proof of the confidence I have in you based on everything I've heard about you. I rely on you to be discreet and not gossip about the matter. Above all, preserve this coronet with the utmost care because, needless to say, a major public scandal would erupt if anything were to happen to it. Any damage to it would be almost as serious as its complete loss, because there are no beryls in the world to match these, and it would be impossible to replace them. However, I leave it with you with complete confidence, and I'll call for it in person on Monday morning." Seeing that my client was eager to leave, I said nothing more, but, calling for my cashier, I instructed him to pay over £51,000 notes. When I was alone once more, however, with the precious case lying on the table in front of me, I couldn't help but think, with some concern, about the enormous responsibility I had taken on. There was no question that, since this was a national treasure, a terrible scandal would follow if anything happened to it. I already regretted ever agreeing to take charge of it, but it was too late to change things now, so I locked it up in my private safe and returned to my work. As evening approached, I felt it would be unwise to leave such a valuable item in the office. Bankers' safes have been broken into before, and why shouldn't mine be? If that happened, what a terrible position I would find myself in. I decided, therefore, that for the next few days I would carry the case with me wherever I went, so it would never be truly out of my reach. With this in mind, I called a cab and drove home to Streatham, carrying the jewel with me. I didn't breathe freely until I had taken it upstairs and locked it in the bureau of my dressing room. And now, a word about my household, Mr. Holmes, because I want you to fully understand the situation. My groom and my page sleep outside the house, and they can be completely disregarded. I have 3 maidservants who have been with me for many years, and their complete reliability is beyond any doubt. Another maid, Lucy Parr, the second waiting maid, has only been in my service for a few months. She came with an excellent reference, however, and has always been satisfactory. She's a very pretty girl and has attracted some admirers who have sometimes hung around the place. That's the only drawback we've found with her, but we believe her to be a good girl in every way. So much for the servants. My family is quite small, so I won't take long to describe it. I am a widower and have only one son, Arthur. He has been a disappointment to me, Mr. Holmes, a great disappointment. I have no doubt I'm to blame myself. People tell me I've spoiled him. I probably have. When my dear wife died, I felt that he was all I had left to love. I couldn't bear to see the smile leave his face, even for a moment. I've never denied him anything he wanted. Perhaps it would have been better for both of us if I had been stricter, but I always meant well. Naturally, I intended for him to take over my business, but he just wasn't cut out for it. He was wild, wayward, and, to tell the truth, I couldn't trust him with large sums of money. When he was young, he joined an aristocratic club, and there, with his charming manners, he quickly became close with a number of men with deep pockets and expensive habits. He learned to gamble heavily and squander money on horse racing, until he had to come to me again and again, begging me to give him an advance on his allowance so he could settle his debts of honor. He tried more than once to break free from the dangerous company he was keeping, but each time the influence of his friend, Sir George Burnwell, was enough to pull him back in. And indeed, I couldn't help but understand how someone like Sir George Burnwell could have such an influence on him, because he often brought him to my house, and I found myself drawn to his charm. He's older than Arthur, a true man of the world, someone who's been everywhere and seen everything. He's a brilliant conversationalist and very handsome. But when I think of him calmly, away from the allure of his presence, I'm convinced, from his cynical remarks and the look in his eyes, that he's someone who should be deeply distrusted. I believe this, and so does my dear Mary, who has a woman's keen intuition. And now there's only her left to describe. She's my niece, but when my brother died 5 years ago and left her alone in the world, I adopted her and have considered her my daughter ever since. She's a ray of sunshine in my house, sweet, loving, beautiful, a wonderful manager and housekeeper, yet as kind, quiet, and gentle as any woman could be. She's my right hand. I don't know what I would do without her. There's only one thing she's ever gone against my wishes about. Twice my son has asked her to marry him because he loves her dearly, but each time she's refused him. I think that if anyone could have led him on the right path, it would have been her, and that his marriage might have changed his whole life. But now, alas, it's too late. Forever too late. Now, Mr. Holmes, you know the people who live in my home, and I shall continue with my miserable story. When we were having coffee in the drawing room that night after dinner, I told Arthur and Mary about my experience and the valuable treasure we had under our roof, only not mentioning the name of my client. Lucy Parr, who had brought in the coffee, had, I'm sure, left the room, but I can't swear that the door was closed. Mary and Arthur were very interested and wanted to see the famous coronet, but I thought it better to leave it alone. "Where have you put it?" asked Arthur. "In my own bureau." "Well, I hope to goodness the house won't be robbed tonight," he said. "It's locked up," I answered. "Oh, any old key will fit that bureau. When I was a boy, I used to open it myself with the key from the box room cupboard." He often had a way of talking wildly, so I didn't really think much of what he said. He followed me to my room that night, however, with a very serious face. "Listen, Dad," he said, looking down, "could you lend me £200? "No, I can't," I answered sharply. "I've been far too generous with you when it comes to money." "You've been very kind," he said, "but I need this money, or I can never show my face at the club again." "And good riddance," I cried. "Yes, but you wouldn't want me to be dishonored," he said. "I couldn't bear the shame. I have to get the money somehow, and if you won't lend it to me, I'll have to find another way." I was very angry because this was the third time he'd asked me for money in a month. "You won't get a penny from me," I shouted, and he bowed and left the room without another word. When he was gone, I unlocked my bureau, made sure my treasure was safe, and locked it again. Then I started to walk around the house to check that everything was secure, a duty I usually leave to Mary, but I thought it was best to do it myself that night. As I was coming down the stairs, I saw Mary at the side window of the hallway. She closed and locked it as I approached. "Dad," she said, looking a little worried, "did you give Lucy, the maid, permission to go out tonight?" "Certainly not." "She just came in through the back door. I'm sure she just went to the side gate to see someone, but I think it's not very safe and we should stop her from doing that." "You should talk to her in the morning, or I will, if you'd prefer it. Are you sure everything is locked up?" "Absolutely sure, Dad." "Good night, then." I kissed her and went back up to my bedroom, where I quickly fell asleep. I'm trying to tell you everything, Mr. Holmes, that might be relevant to this case, but please ask me about anything I haven't made clear. On the contrary, your explanation is incredibly clear. I'm coming to a part of my story now that I want to be especially clear about. I'm not a very heavy sleeper, and the worry on my mind probably made me sleep even lighter than usual. Around 2 in the morning, then, I was woken up by a sound in the house. It stopped before I was fully awake, but it left an impression as if a window had been closed gently somewhere. I lay there, listening carefully. Suddenly, to my horror, I heard a distinct sound of footsteps, moving quietly in the next room. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding with fear, and peeked around the corner of my dressing-room door. "Arthur!" I screamed. "You scoundrel! You thief! How dare you touch that coronet?" The gas was half on, just as I'd left it, and my unfortunate boy, dressed only in his shirt and trousers, was standing near the light, holding the coronet in his hands. He seemed to be trying to wrench it apart or bend it with all his might. At my scream, he dropped it from his grasp and turned as white as death. I snatched it up and examined it. One of the gold corners, with 3 of the barrels in it, was missing. "You blackguard!" I shouted beside myself with fury. "You've destroyed it! You've dishonored me forever! Where are the jewels you've stolen?" "Stolen!" he cried. "Yes, thief!" I roared, shaking him by the shoulder. "There are none missing. There can't be any missing," he said. "There are 3 missing, and you know where they are. Do I have to call you a liar as well as a thief?" Didn't I see you trying to break off another piece? You've called me enough names, he said. I won't take it anymore. I'm not going to say another word about this since you've chosen to insult me. I'll leave your house in the morning and make my own way in the world. You'll leave it in the hands of the police, I cried, half crazy with grief and anger. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. You'll learn nothing from me, he said with a fury I wouldn't have thought possible in his nature. If you want to call the police, let them find what they can. By this time, the whole house was awake, because I'd shouted so loudly. Mary was the first to rush into my room, and at the sight of the coronet and Arthur's face, she understood what had happened, and, with a scream, fainted right there on the floor. I sent the housemaid for the police and immediately turned the investigation over to them. When the inspector and a constable arrived, Arthur, who had stood sullenly with his arms folded, asked me if I was going to accuse him of theft. I answered that it was no longer a private matter but had become a public one, since the damaged coronet was national property. I was determined that the law should take its course in everything. At least, he said, you won't have me arrested immediately. It would be to your advantage as well as mine if I could leave the house for 5 minutes. So you can get away, or maybe to hide what you've stolen, I said. And then, realizing the terrible position I was in, I begged him to remember that not only my honor, but the honor of someone far greater than I was at stake. He was threatening to cause a scandal that would shake the nation. He could prevent it all if he would just tell me what he had done with the 3 missing stones. You might as well face the truth, I said. You were caught red-handed, and no confession could make your guilt worse. If you'll just do what you can to make things right, by telling us where the barrels are, everything will be forgiven and forgotten. Keep your forgiveness for those who ask for it, he answered, turning away from me with a sneer. I realized he was too hardened for my words to have any effect on him. There was only one course of action. I called in the inspector and placed him under arrest. A search was immediately made, not only of his person, but of his room, and every part of the house where he could possibly have hidden the gems, but no trace of them could be found. The poor boy refused to speak, despite all our pleading and threats. This morning, he was taken to a cell, and I, having dealt with all the police formalities, have rushed over to you, begging you to use your skills to solve this matter. The police have openly admitted that they have no leads at the moment. You can spend whatever you think is necessary. I've already offered a reward of £1,000. My God, what am I going to do? I have lost my honor, my jewels, and my son all in one night. Oh, what am I going to do? He placed his hands on either side of his head and rocked back and forth, moaning to himself like a child whose grief is too overwhelming to put into words. Sherlock Holmes sat silent for a few moments, his brows furrowed and his eyes fixed on the fire. "Do you get many visitors?" he asked. "None except my partner and his family, and an occasional friend of Arthur's. Sir George Burnwell has been over a few times recently. No one else, I think." "Do you go out much in society?" "Arthur does. Mary and I stay at home. We neither of us care for it very much." "That's unusual for a young girl." "She's a quiet person. Besides, she's not that young. She's 24. This whole thing seems to have been a shock to her as well." "Terrible. She's even more affected than I am." "Neither of you have any doubt about your son's guilt?" "How could we, when I saw him with my own eyes holding the coronet?" "I wouldn't consider that conclusive proof. Was the rest of the coronet damaged at all?" "Yes, it was twisted." "Don't you think, then, that he might have been trying to straighten it?" "God bless you. You're doing what you can for him and for me. But it's too big a task. What was he doing there at all? If his motives were innocent, why didn't he say so? Exactly. And if they were guilty, why didn't he make up a lie? His silence seems to suggest both possibilities. There are several curious details about this case. What did the police think about the noise that woke you? They thought it might have been Arthur closing his bedroom door. A likely story, as if a man planning to commit a crime would slam his door so loudly as to wake everyone in the house. What did they say then about the missing gems? They're still checking the floorboards and looking behind the furniture, hoping to find them. Have they thought of looking outside the house? Yes, they've been incredibly energetic. The entire garden has been thoroughly searched. Now, my dear sir, said Holmes, isn't it clear to you now that this matter goes much deeper than either you or the police first thought? It seemed like a simple case to you, but to me, it's incredibly complex. Consider what your theory implies. You believe that your son got out of bed, went at great risk to your dressing room, opened your bureau, took out your coronet, broke off a small part of it with brute force, went somewhere else, hid 3 of the gems out of 39, so cleverly that no one can find them, and then returned with the other 36 gems to the very room where he was most likely to be caught. I ask you, is such a theory possible? But what other theory is there? Cried the banker with a gesture of despair. If his motives were innocent, why didn't he explain them? It's our job to find that out, replied Holmes. So, if you please, Mr. Holder, we'll set off for Streatham together and spend an hour looking more closely at the details. My friend insisted that I join them on their trip, and I was more than willing to go, because my curiosity and sympathy had been stirred by the story we had heard. I confess that I, like the banker, thought his son's guilt was obvious, but I had so much faith in Holmes's judgment that I knew there had to be some hope as long as he wasn't satisfied with the accepted explanation. He barely spoke a word the whole way to the southern suburb, but sat with his chin on his chest and his hat pulled over his eyes, lost in deep thought. Our client seemed to have taken heart at this little glimmer of hope, and he even struck up a casual conversation with me about his business affairs. A short train journey and an even shorter walk brought us to Fairbank, the modest home of the great financier. Fairbank was a large, square house of white stone, set back a little from the road. A double driveway with a snow-covered lawn stretched down in front to 2 large iron gates that closed the entrance. On the right side was a small thicket of trees, which led to a narrow path between 2 neat hedges. This path extended from the road to the kitchen door and formed the tradesman's entrance. On the left was a lane leading to the stables, which was not actually part of the property, being a public thoroughfare, although little used. Holmes left us standing at the door and walked slowly around the house, across the front, down the tradesman's path, and then around the back garden into the stable lane. He was gone for so long that Mr. Holder and I went into the dining room and waited by the fire for his return. We were sitting there in silence when the door opened and a young lady entered. She was slightly taller than average, slender, with dark hair and eyes, which seemed even darker against the absolute paleness of her skin. I don't think I've ever seen such a deathly pallor on a woman's face. Her lips, too, were bloodless, but her eyes were red from crying. As she moved silently into the room, she made a deeper impression of grief on me than the banker had in the morning. And it was all the more striking because she was clearly a woman of strong character, capable of immense self-control. Ignoring my presence, she walked straight up to her uncle and placed her hand on his head, offering a sweet, womanly caress. "Dad, did you tell them to let Arthur go?" Mary asked, her voice tinged with worry. "No, my dear, "We have to get to the bottom of this," her father, Mr. Holder, said firmly. "But I'm positive he's innocent. You know what women's intuition is like. I know he didn't do anything wrong, and you'll regret being so harsh." "Then why isn't he speaking up if he's innocent?" her father asked. "Who knows? Maybe he's just angry that you'd even think he'd do something like that," Mary suggested. "How could I not suspect him when I saw him holding the coronet?" Mr. Holder exclaimed. "He was just looking at it, Dad. Please, trust me. He's innocent. Let's drop it. It's awful to think of our dear Arthur in prison." "I won't drop it until the gems are found, Mary. Your love for Arthur is blinding you to the consequences for me. I haven't tried to hide anything. I've brought a detective from London to investigate this fully." "This gentleman?" Mary asked, turning to me. "No, his friend. He wants us to leave him alone. He's in the stable lane right now," Mr. Holder explained. "The stable lane?" Mary raised an eyebrow, curious. What could he hope to find there? "Ah, I suppose this is him. Sir, I trust you will succeed in proving what I know to be true, that my cousin Arthur is innocent of this crime." "I share your opinion, and I trust with you that we can prove it," replied Holmes, brushing the snow off his shoes. "I believe I have the honor of addressing Miss Mary Holder. Might I ask you a few questions?" "Please do, sir, if it helps clear up this mess." "Did you hear anything yourself last night?" "Nothing, until my uncle here started speaking loudly. I heard that, and I came down." "You closed the windows and doors the night before. Did you fasten all the windows?" "Yes." "Were they all fastened this morning?" "Yes." "You have a maid who has a boyfriend? I believe you mentioned last night she was out to see him." "Yes, and she was the one who waited in the drawing room, so she might have overheard Uncle's remarks about the coronet." "I see. You think she might have gone out to tell her boyfriend, and they planned the robbery?" Holmes deduced. "But what good are these vague theories?" the banker exclaimed impatiently. "I told you I saw Arthur with the coronet." "Hold on, Mr. Holder. We'll come back to that. About this girl, Miss Holder. You saw her return through the kitchen door, I presume?" "Yes. When I went to check the door for the night, I saw her slipping in. I saw the man, too, in the shadows." "Do you know him?" "Oh, yes. He's the greengrocer who delivers our vegetables. His name is Francis Prosper." "He stood to the left of the door," Holmes stated, "further up the path than necessary to reach the door?" "Yes, he did." "And he has a wooden leg?" Fear flickered in Mary's dark eyes. "You're like a magician," she exclaimed. "How do you know that?" She tried to smile, but Holmes's thin, eager face remained unsmiling. "I'd like to go upstairs now," he said. "I'll probably want to look around the outside of the house again. Maybe I should take a look at the lower windows before I go up." He swiftly walked around the house, pausing only at the large window leading from the hall to the stable lane. He opened it and carefully examined the sill with his magnifying glass. "Now, we shall go upstairs," he said finally. The banker's dressing room was a simple room with a gray carpet, a large bureau, and a long mirror. Holmes approached the bureau first and examined the lock. "Which key was used to open it?" he asked. "The one my son indicated, the key to the cupboard in the lumber room." "Do you have it here?" "It's on the dressing table." Holmes took the key and opened the bureau. "It's a silent lock," he noted. "No wonder it didn't wake you. This case, I presume, contains the coronet. We must take a look at it." He opened the case and placed the diadem on the table. It was a magnificent piece of jewelry, and the 36 stones were the finest I had ever seen. There was a cracked edge on one side of the coronet, where a corner holding 3 gems had been torn away. "Now, Mr. Holder," Holmes said, "here's the corner corresponding to the one that was lost. Might I ask you to break it off?" The banker recoiled in horror. "I wouldn't even think about trying," he said. "Then I will." Holmes suddenly exerted his strength, but it wouldn't break. "I feel it give a little," he said, "but even though I'm exceptionally strong in my fingers, it would take me forever. An ordinary man couldn't do it. Now, what do you think would happen if I did break it, Mr. Holder? It would make a noise like a pistol shot. Are you telling me all of this happened within a few yards of your bed, and you heard nothing? I don't know what to think. It's all dark to me. But perhaps it'll become clearer as we go. What do you think, Miss Holder?" "I confess I still share my uncle's confusion. Your son had no shoes or slippers on when you saw him?" "He had nothing on but his trousers and shirt." "Thank you. We've been incredibly lucky during this investigation, and it'll be our own fault if we don't solve it. With your permission, Mr. Holder, I'll continue my investigation outside." He went alone, as he requested, explaining that any unnecessary footprints might make his task more difficult. For an hour or more he worked, returning with his feet heavy with snow and his features as inscrutable as ever. "I believe I've seen all there is to see, Mr. Holder," he said. "I can best serve you by returning to my rooms." "But the gems, Mr. Holmes? Where are they?" "I can't tell you." The banker wrung his hands. "I'll never see them again," he cried. "And my son? You give me hope? My opinion hasn't changed. Then, for God's sake, what happened in my house last night? If you can visit me at my Baker Street rooms tomorrow morning between 9 and 10, I'll do what I can to make it clearer. I understand you give me carte blanche to act for you, as long as I recover the gems and you place no limit on the sum I can draw. I'd give my fortune to have them back." "Very good. I'll look into the matter until then. Goodbye. It's possible I might need to come back here before evening." It was obvious to me that my companion had formed his opinion on the case, though I couldn't even imagine what his conclusions were. Several times on our journey home, I tried to get him to talk about it, but he always changed the subject. I finally gave up. It was not yet 3 when we reached our rooms. He rushed to his chamber and returned a few minutes later, dressed as a common loafer. With his collar turned up, his shiny, seedy coat, his red cravat, and worn boots, he was a perfect example of that class. "I think this should do," he said, glancing at himself in the mirror. "I wish you could come with me, Watson, but I'm afraid it won't work. I might be on the trail in this matter, or I might be chasing a will-o'-the-wisp, but I'll soon know which it is. I hope to be back in a few hours." He cut a slice of beef from the joint on the sideboard, made a sandwich with 2 rounds of bread, shoved it in his pocket, and started off. I had just finished my tea when he returned, seemingly in excellent spirits, swinging an old elastic-sided boot in his hand. He tossed it into a corner and poured himself a cup of tea. "I just stopped in as I was passing," he said. "I'm going right on." "Where to?" "Oh, to the other side of the West End. It might be some time before I get back. Don't wait up for me if I'm late." "How are you getting on?" "Oh, so-so. Nothing to complain about. I've been to Streatham since I saw you last, but I didn't call at the house. It's a very interesting little problem, and I wouldn't have missed it for anything. However, I shouldn't gossip here. I need to get these disreputable clothes off and return to my highly respectable self." I could tell from his manner that he was more satisfied than his words implied. His eyes twinkled, and there was even a touch of color on his sallow cheeks. He hurried upstairs, and a few minutes later I heard the slam of the hall door, indicating he was off on his hunt again. I waited until midnight, but there was no sign of him, so I retired to my room. It wasn't unusual for him to be gone for days and nights at a time when he was on a case, so his lateness didn't surprise me. I don't know what time he came in, but when I came down for breakfast, he was there with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, as fresh and tidy as ever. "You'll excuse my starting without you, Watson," he said, "but you remember our client has a rather early appointment this morning." "Why, it's after 9 now," I answered. "I wouldn't be surprised if that was him. I thought I heard a ring." It was indeed our friend, the financier. I was shocked by the change in him, for his naturally broad and massive face was now pinched and fallen in, and his hair seemed whiter. He entered with a weariness and lethargy more painful than his violent outburst the previous morning, and he sank heavily into the armchair I pulled forward for him. "I don't know what I've done to be so severely tried," he said. "Just 2 days ago, I was a happy and prosperous man with no worries in the world. Now I'm left with a lonely and dishonored age. One sorrow follows another. My niece, Mary, has deserted me." "Deserted you?" "Yes. Her bed hadn't been slept in this morning, her room was empty, and a note for me was on the hall table. I told her last night, in sorrow and not anger, that if she had married my boy, all might have been well for him. Maybe it was foolish of me to say that. She refers to that remark in this note: "My dearest uncle, I feel I've brought trouble upon you, and that if I had acted differently, this terrible misfortune might never have occurred. With this thought in my mind, I can never again be happy under your roof, and I feel I must leave you forever. Don't worry about my future, for it's provided for. And above all, don't search for me, for it will be fruitless labor and an ill service to me. In life or in death, I am ever your loving Mary." What could she mean by that note, Mr. Holmes? Do you think it points to suicide? No, nothing of the kind. It's perhaps the best possible solution. I trust, Mr. Holder, that you're nearing the end of your troubles. Ha! You say so. You've heard something, Mr. Holmes. You've learned something. Where are the gems? Would you consider £1,000 apiece an excessive sum for them? I'd pay 10. That would be unnecessary. 3,000 will cover the matter. And there's a small reward, I think. Do you have your checkbook? Here's a pen. Better make it out for £4,000. With a dazed face, the banker wrote the check. Holmes walked over to his desk, took out a small triangular piece of gold with 3 gems in it, and threw it on the table. With a shriek of joy, our client grabbed it. "You have it!" he gasped. "I'm saved! I'm saved!" His reaction of joy was as passionate as his grief had been, and he hugged his recovered gems to his chest. "There's one other thing you owe, Mr. Holder," said Sherlock Holmes, rather sternly. "Oh," he snatched up a pen. "Name the sum, and I'll pay it." "No, the debt isn't to me. You owe a very humble apology to that noble lad, your son, who has conducted himself in this matter as I'd be proud to see my own son do, should I ever have one." "Then it wasn't Arthur who took them?" "I told you yesterday, and I repeat today, that it was not." "You're sure of it? Then let's hurry to him and let him know the truth is known." "He knows it already. When I'd cleared it all up, I had an interview with him. When he wouldn't tell me the story, I told it to him, and he confessed that I was right, and added the few details that were still unclear to me. Your news this morning, however, might make him talk. For heaven's sake, tell me what this extraordinary mystery is." "I will, and I'll show you the steps I took to reach this point. And let me say this first, which is the hardest thing for me to say, and for you to hear. There's been an understanding between Sir George Burnwell and your niece Mary. They've now fled together." "My Mary? Impossible." "Unfortunately, it's more than possible, it's certain. Neither you nor your son knew the true character of this man when you let him into your family circle. He's one of the most dangerous men in England, a ruined gambler, an absolutely desperate villain, a man without heart or conscience. Your niece knew nothing of such men. When he breathed his vows to her, As he'd done to 100 before her, she flattered herself that she alone had touched his heart. The devil knows best what he said, but she became his tool and was in the habit of seeing him almost every evening. "I can't and I won't believe it," cried the banker, his face ashen. "I'll tell you what happened in your house last night. Your niece, when you thought you'd gone to your room, slipped down and talked to her lover through the window leading to the stable lane. His footprints were deeply pressed in the snow. He'd been standing there for a while. She told him about the coronet. His wicked lust for gold was ignited, and he bent her to his will. I have no doubt that she loved you, but some women's love for a lover extinguishes all other loves, and I think she must have been one of those. She hadn't even listened to his instructions when she saw you coming downstairs, so she quickly closed the window and told you about the servant's escapade with her wooden-legged lover, which was entirely true. Your boy, Arthur, went to bed after his interview with you, but he slept poorly because he was worried about his club debts. In the middle of the night, he heard a soft tread pass his door, so he got up and, looking out, was surprised to see his cousin walking very stealthily along the passage until she disappeared into your dressing room. Petrified with astonishment, the lad slipped on some clothes and waited there in the dark to see what would come of this strange affair. She emerged from the room again, and in the light of the passage lamp, your son saw that she carried the precious coronet in her hands. She went down the stairs, and he, terrified, ran along and hid behind the curtain near your door, where he could see what happened in the hall below. He saw her stealthily open the window, hand out the coronet to someone in the shadows, and then close it again and hurry back to her room, passing very close to where he stood hidden behind the curtain. As long as she was on the scene, he couldn't act without a horrible exposure of the woman he loved. But the instant she was gone, he realized how crushing a misfortune this would be for you, and how important it was to set things right. He rushed downstairs as he was, in his bare feet, opened the window, jumped out into the snow, and ran down the lane, where he could see a dark figure in the moonlight. Sir George Burnwell tried to get away, but Arthur caught him, and they struggled, your lad tugging at one side of the coronet, and his opponent at the other. In the scuffle, your son struck Sir George and cut him over the eye. Then something suddenly snapped, and your son, finding he had the coronet in his hands, rushed back, closed the window, went up to your room, and had just noticed that the coronet had been twisted in the struggle and was trying to straighten it when you appeared. "Is it possible?" gasped the banker. You then angered him by insulting him at a moment when he felt he deserved your warmest thanks. He couldn't explain the true situation without betraying the woman who certainly deserved little consideration from him. He took the more chivalrous view, however, and kept her secret. "And that's why she shrieked and fainted when she saw the coronet," cried Mr. Holder. "Oh my God, what a blind fool I've been! And his asking to be allowed to go out for 5 minutes. The dear fellow wanted to see if the missing piece was at the scene of the struggle. How cruelly I've misjudged him." "When I arrived at the house," Holmes continued, "I immediately went around very carefully to see if there were any traces in the snow that could help me. I knew none had fallen since the evening before, and there had been a hard frost to preserve impressions. I went along the tradesman's path, but it was all trampled down and indistinguishable. Just beyond it, however, at the far side of the kitchen door, a woman had stood and talked to a man whose round impressions on one side showed that he had a wooden leg. I could even tell that they had been disturbed, for the woman had run swiftly back to the door, as shown by the deep toe and light heel marks, while Wooden Leg had waited a little and then had gone away. I thought at the time that this might be the maid and her sweetheart, of whom you had already spoken to me, and inquiry showed it was so. I went around the garden without seeing anything more than random tracks, which I took to be the police. But when I got into the stable lane, a very long and complex story was written in the snow in front of me. There was a double line of tracks of a booted man, and a second double line, which I saw with delight, belonged to a man with naked feet. I was at once convinced, from what you had told me, that the latter was your son. The first had walked both ways, but the other had run swiftly, and as his tread was marked in places over the depression of the boot, it was obvious that he had passed after the other. I followed them up and found they led to the hall window, where Boots had worn all the snow away while waiting. Then I walked to the other end, which was 100 yards or more down the lane. I saw where Boots had faced round, where the snow was cut up as though there had been a struggle, and, finally, where a few drops of blood had fallen, to show me that I was not mistaken. Boots had then run down the lane, and another little smudge of blood showed that it was he who had been hurt. When he came to the high road at the other end, I found that the pavement had been cleared, so there was an end to that clue. On entering the house, however, I examined, as you remember, the sill and framework of the hall window with my lens, and I could at once see that someone had passed out. I could distinguish the outline of an instep where the wet foot had been placed in coming in. I was then beginning to be able to form an opinion as to what had occurred. A man had waited outside the window. Someone had brought the gems. The deed had been overseen by your son. He had pursued the thief, had struggled with him. They had each tugged at the coronet, their united strength causing injuries which neither alone could have effected. He had returned with the prize, but had left a fragment in the grasp of his opponent. So far I was clear. The question now was, who was the man, and who was it brought him the coronet? It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now, I knew that it was not you who had brought it down, so there only remained your niece and the maids. But if it were the maids, why should your son allow himself to be accused in their place? There could be no possible reason. As he loved his cousin, however, there was an excellent explanation why he should retain her secret. The more so as the secret was a disgraceful one. When I remembered that you had seen her at that window, and how she had fainted on seeing the coronet again, my conjecture became a certainty. And who could it be who was her confederate? A lover, evidently, for who else could outweigh the love and gratitude which she must feel to you? I knew that you went out little, and that your circle of friends was a very limited one. But among them was Sir George Burnwell. I had heard of him before as being a man of evil reputation among women. It must have been he who wore those boots and retained the missing gems. Even though he knew that Arthur had discovered him, he might still flatter himself that he was safe, for the lad could not say a word without compromising his own family. Well, your own good sense will suggest what measures I took next. I went in the shape of a loafer to Sir George's house, managed to pick up an acquaintance with his valet, learned that his master had cut his head the night before, and, finally, at the expense of 6 shillings, made all sure by buying a pair of his cast-off shoes. With these, I journeyed down to Streatham and saw that they exactly fitted the tracks. "I saw an ill-dressed vagabond in the lane yesterday evening," said Mr. Holder. "Precisely. It was I. I found that I had my man, so I came home and changed my clothes. It was a delicate part which I had to play then, for I saw that a prosecution must be avoided to avert scandal, and I knew that so astute a villain would see that our hands were tied in the matter. I went and saw him. At first, of course, he denied everything, but when I gave him every particular that had occurred, he tried to bluster and took down a life-preserver from the wall. I knew my man, however, and I clapped a pistol to his head before he could strike. Then he became a little more reasonable. I told him that we would give him a price for the stones he held, £1,000 apiece. That brought out the first signs of grief that he had shown. "Why, dash it all," said he, "I've let them go at 600 for the 3. I soon managed to get the address of the receiver who had them, on promising him that there would be no prosecution. Off I set to him, and after much chaffering, I got our stones at £1,000 apiece. Then I looked in upon your son, told him that all was right, and eventually got to my bed about 2 o'clock, after what I may call a really hard day's work. A day which has saved England from a great public scandal," said the banker, rising. "Sir, I cannot find words to thank you, but you shall not find me ungrateful for what you have done. Your skill has indeed exceeded all that I have heard of it. And now I must fly to my dear boy to apologize to him for the wrong which I have done him. As to what you tell me of poor Mary, it goes to my very heart. Not even your skill can inform me where she is now." "I think that we may safely say," returned Holmes, "that she is wherever Sir George Burnwell is. It is equally certain, too, that whatever her sins are, they will soon receive a more than sufficient punishment." The end. If you like the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.